Walt, it's such a pleasure to have you on the Everything Saxophone podcast. Thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure, Donna. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, we were chatting a little bit before, and we actually know each other from quite a while ago at Queens College around the late 1980s, early 1990s and stuff. So I want to be talking about that in a few minutes. So can you, you're an author, you're an amazing player, and you've toured with some of the most iconic people ever, and you're still right now with Steely Dan, which is just insane. So before we get into that stuff, let me just let people know more about you. And what I'm always curious about, when did you start getting involved with playing music? Was saxophone your first instrument? How did it all evolve for you?
I guess I grew up with music in my household because my dad was and is a good piano player. He was classically trained, never knew anything about jazz, but I grew up with Chopin in the house, and he could play. He was a terrific sight reader, so he could play tunes out of Broadway show books. And in the ninth grade, well, as a matter of fact, I took piano lessons when I was very young, but I think I was just too immature for it to really take hold. And I quit the piano, which might be, professionally speaking, my biggest regret to date, that I quit piano lessons. I guess I was 5 at the time. And when I was 9 in the 4th grade, that's when we started instrumental music in school. So I chose the clarinet, I guess, because 2 of my friends were going to play the clarinet. My cousin played the clarinet, and I quickly realized that I was more adept at it than my peers. And within a few years, I wanted to play the saxophone and had to lobby my parents to get me a saxophone. That took a while. But finally, in the 8th grade, they got me a brand new Vito saxophone. And I was playing in the band and the middle school jazz ensemble, which I just always was just chomping at the bit to do. And I had a ball and played in all the ensembles. That was my sport when I was in school, all the way through high school. And I began to take it more seriously around maybe the 10th grade. I had a very good teacher, and he more or less read me the riot act at a certain point, and he said, I expect you to get going with this. Now is the time. And for whatever reason, I guess it made an impression on me, and I began to practice more steadily and earnestly. And by the junior year in high school, I thought about preparing for college auditions, and I went to the Eastman School of Music in 1977, fall of 77. And I had a ball there, had a great time. And then after I finished school, I moved to the New York area, moved to Brooklyn with completely no idea how I was going to subsist or what I was going to do. I just had this vague idea that I'm going. And I stuck it out, made a life for myself. And years later, here I am, survived.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I have to ask a few questions. Where did you grow up? Was it upstate New York or something?
It was outside of Syracuse, New York.
Okay,
we had a very good music program in school, all the way through school. I'm very grateful for those opportunities. I remember my elementary, middle, and high school band directors very fondly.
Okay.
They were terrific for me.
Yeah, you know why I'm saying this? Because I'm just thinking about my own experience. I grew up on Long Island, so in New York.
Oh, what town?
New Hyde Park.
Uh-huh.
Right outside, not the Queens part, the island.
Yeah, well, you must have had very strong school music also.
Yeah, I did actually. And it's funny because, you mentioned, like, I had Alexa Tarantino on as well and Lauren Sevion as well. And, lots of similar things starting fourth grade with instrumental music. In the city, they don't do that. In New York City, they start in seventh grade. Right. And the sick thing about this is not every kid gets a chance to take an instrument. It's only, and this, I taught for a little bit in the city schools and it irritated me. But only the advanced kids in the advanced classes could take an instrument. Can you believe that? That's terrible.
I did not know that. I did know that school music in the city schools is very sporadic and not like it was in the suburbs, sad to say.
Yeah, for sure. And at least that was in the school that I was at in Forest Hills. I was lucky. I had exposure to music, all the way through. Not some good teachers for sure. Unfortunately, one of the greatest teachers retired like 1 year after I had her. But I was thinking you were in New York, especially when you mentioned your upbringing and stuff. When you were at Eastman, were you you were a performance major, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. Did you have any exposure to? I'm just curious because I was talking with one of the previous guests about this. A couple of guests actually. Were you exposed to any kind of music learning theory, Edwin Gordon types of things? I'm wondering if they even had that at the time.
I don't think so. It was pretty early on. Keep in mind, I was in school at 1977 for until 1980, and I don't recall. I mean, of course, I wasn't studying education or pedagogy per se, but I don't have any recollection of that.
Okay.
It was pretty much straight ahead. I studied the saxophone literature, and they had a terrific jazz program, although there was no jazz major at that time.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah, but I was very active. I was as active as I could be in the jazz program.
Got it. So then you were there for classical, and in a sense, your degree was pretty much classical, right?
I went there for saxophone. At the time, jazz programs were not as common. I did consider North Texas State. Now it's called UNT, University of North Texas. But that was the only jazz major that I considered. And I think at that time, I just was a little bit reluctant to go to school as far away as Texas. And Eastman was an hour and a half away. It did not really occur to me that I wanted a jazz major. I went to Eastman and I did get disillusioned with having to study the saxophone repertoire. I wasn't all that excited. Okay. And it worked out. I mean, I was a knucklehead kid in a lot of ways. I didn't want to do music theory and all that kind of stuff. But I'm very, very, very glad that I was there and I stuck it out.
I'm surprised from what I know of you. I'm shocked that you're saying that you weren't into that.
I was a slow learner, Donna. I remember being very disillusioned that I had to take English class in school. I thought it was going to be all music all the time. Oh. But of course, as an adult, I'm very grateful that I got some kind of education.
Yeah, for sure. Because I mean, you have tons of books and tons of like music books and stuff like that. And it's not beginner material. This is advanced stuff. So I'm kind of shocked. You're saying you weren't so into the theory at the time, but
I was force fed. Unfortunately, the idea of structure is exactly for people like me who just really didn't understand what they needed to be successful in music, and enough of it stuck that I was able to draw from it in all those years succeeding my education. But at the time, I was not a great student.
Wow. Okay. Wow. That blows my mind. And, I'm curious about two things. I'm wondering, first of all, how long did you play the piano? Was it just a few months? Was it a year?
Oh, just a few months. Yeah. I can't play anything in time. I can basically just play, I suppose, a beginner version of a ranger's piano. I can plunk out chords and use it in a way that is certainly useful to me, but I could never perform anything.
That's me too. Actually, I'm like, I've got two really two right hands. I can't stand the left hand. That's why Queens College, with all that, we were talking about this before. You have to, as a bachelor's, in order to graduate, you have to do these comprehensive exams, and you have to analyze like 3 different pieces, and you have to play, like you have to look at a score and reduce the score so you could play it on piano, like on site. And boy, that was fun. Anyway. No, I'm kidding, folks. But all right, because I was just thinking to myself, I'm wondering if that very early piano experience may have helped you subconsciously, but it probably did.
I hope.
Yeah.
I don't, it's, of course, it's pretty hard to separate all that stuff, but certainly what definitely made an impression was hearing my father play all that great music. He had a terrific repertoire. That definitely had a lasting impression on me. So maybe from that standpoint, I was more naturally open to being able to play classical music, even though I didn't really want to do that.
Yeah.
But actually, there was a phase when I was in school that, typical of my rebellious nature, I decided that I wanted to change majors. I wanted to be a clarinet major instead, because I felt that the saxophone literature was just not interesting enough for me. And if I was going to be in school and be a classical major, that I wanted to play in the orchestra. I wasn't excited about playing a wind ensemble. And I actually went as far as auditioning on the clarinet to switch majors.
Wow.
And long story short, it didn't work out, which was, I think, for the best. I'm very, very grateful for whether it's coincidence or design that I was forced to finish my saxophone degree, because in years succeeding, what I told students many, many times was that you got to be able to play the horn to a certain level of mastery before you can learn how to play jazz. It's just a prerequisite. And that's something that the jazz major is sometimes at odds with, because people want to get ahead of themselves before they can play their instrument properly. They want to play jazz, but it's very hard to have that kind of multi-dimensional thing going on at once, trying to master your instrument and trying to learn how to play jazz.
I was going to ask you, especially also because you did start on clarinet, which there's more literature for that than saxophone, and, the effect of that on your technique, playing, number one, playing classical music, but number two, also starting on clarinet, also doing classical music on clarinet as well. I think you're kind of answering that.
Yeah, I feel very grateful. That was kind of an accident, but it was very helpful to me to play the clarinet at a level that most saxophone players didn't. The old joke about Bill Clinton, all his problems stem from the fact that he started on saxophone and not clarinet. Well, that's, as in our industry, that's a real thing. Doublers who go from saxophone to clarinet have a tougher time. So I had that kind of in my back pocket. Didn't really realize what an asset that was until later on when I began to play professionally. And for me, it was a huge help. I was a professional doubler in New York for 35 years. And even though I don't play the clarinet really anymore, it certainly was a huge, huge influence on my career.
Do you feel that this is going to kind of lead into composing and stuff like that, but all the classical pieces that you've played, clarinet, saxophone, that material can be ingrained in you. It can be internalized. And how much of that comes out in your improvisation, but also as well as your composing?
I think it does. Even though my understanding about theory probably is fairly rudimentary, it's enough to do what I need to do, which is to write in the jazz idiom. I certainly would not try and write anything that was outside that idiom unless it was for fun. But I know that that material made an impression, and I recognized certain harmonies, and it all ties in. But what I didn't understand until I began to be a little more mature was how important theory is to what I was trying to do, which is improvise in the jazz idiom and to arrange and write in the jazz idiom.
How much? So let me ask you that, because I'm going to jump ahead here. How much does the theory affect your? I'm going to say it. How much does the theory affect your improvisation and your composing? Like when you're, so let's say you want to write a new piece. How are you approaching it? That's what I should really ask. How are you approaching it, and how much of a role does theory play in that approach?
That's obviously a good question and a big question. When you analyze really good music from a theoretical standpoint, you begin to understand that there's a reason that things sound good, because they're theoretically sound. So that's something that I keep in mind. Usually when something doesn't sound right, there's a reason that's based in theory about why it doesn't sound right. So you're not going to find that when you analyze great music, because it's all theoretically sound. But when you're someone like me who sometimes pokes around in the dark, and if it doesn't sound right, you can then refer to your basic music theory. There's usually a reason why it doesn't sound right, and that's invaluable. So that's why I always gravitate toward musicians that read and write music. It's one thing to play by ear, but if you don't read and write music, very difficult to bridge that gap. There's some very, very few and far between musicians who could do that, but most of us need to read music as well as play music. Back decades ago, I know that there were lots of great musicians who didn't have the opportunities that we had as kids, and they did not have the opportunity to learn how to read music, and they played by ear. It's amazing to me that they achieved such a high level of competence and greatness, but it doesn't change the fact that it's a lot easier if you know how to read music. It's the same thing with English. I mean, if you have an idea and you can't write it down because you didn't have the opportunity to learn how to read as a child, it's a long, long road to get those kinds of basic ideas across. And the same is true in music. So I'm very, very grateful that from a young age, I was able to learn how to read and write music.
Do you, you mentioned before poking around, like you alluded to the fact that, like when you're poking around and writing stuff and that kind of thing. But couldn't you say also that, with theory, we think about also foundation, like when you get trained, you have to write Bach chorales and you can't break the rules and all that kind of stuff. And only until you know the rules can you break them. But can you elaborate on poking around, like, chord progression? What I find really interesting is that the music of today is quite intriguing. It's definitely not your jazz standards, so to speak, with your 2-5-1s and that kind of things. There's definitely some very unique chord progressions that are going on. They don't have to be so very complicated, but they're definitely very unique. And for someone who's, like, for example, classically trained, and they're sitting there like, wow, why does that do that to that? But it sounds good, right? To me, like, that's the poking around. So how, can you talk about, like, what you mean by poking around and how that relates to, like your training in music theory and stuff like that?
I guess when I said poking around, I'm thinking about an idea that comes to me, or maybe a little motive. And I've learned now, if at all possible, if something comes into my head, to turn on my phone and sing it into the phone, because otherwise I'm likely to lose it. And sometimes that is the most elusive thing. It's just to get that little tiny germ of what can begin the idea of a tune or a composition. I hesitate to use the term composition because mostly what I do is write instrumental jazz. But to me, I guess that poking around has to do with the necessity being the mother of invention. If I have a deadline and I have to write, sometimes even if inspiration doesn't strike, I need to find something. Oftentimes I kind of go back. If I have a lot of unfinished stuff in my inventory, and I'll go back and, I forgot about that. Could I make that into something? What didn't I like about that? What made me pass that over? And sometimes it actually does work out that when you go back to something, there's a little bit of a space you can fill in that maybe you had a different idea, that you can look at it differently, even modulate the key or some other variation that might make it useful to you. A lot of this has to do, to me, with the demystifying of what we do. It's not enough to just wait for inspiration to strike. This is a job that we have. It's a wonderful creative job, but still, your job is to produce. And not everything that I put down on paper, I have the idea that, man, this is the greatest. A lot of it is maybe it can work out to be something that's worth keeping. And I've learned that you can never tell. Sometimes the thing that you write down with that idea that, man, it's going to be great, it just doesn't pan out. And sometimes the thing that you take for granted might be the thing that actually works out to be a tune that stays in your repertoire for years and years. It's very hard to tell. So one thing I've learned is, don't just discard something because it seems too simple or not worth fleshing out.
This is very interesting to me. I'm not going to make any assumptions. So when you're writing, what are you thinking of? Like, are you going to the piano, or are you thinking in terms of your tenor sax, the sound in your head? It's both.
Yeah, definitely both. I have a keyboard right here. I don't have enough piano skills to warrant having an actual piano, so the keyboard is fine. I have my keyboard, I have my computer, I use notation software, all the tools that are helpful to me, I have right at my fingertips. And when you want to be productive and efficient, that's, for me, what you need to have. So to me, it's just however you can facilitate the most productivity, that's what I'm looking for. And if it means that, your task is, on this project, I need a ballad. On this project, I need a blues. On this project, I need an up-tempo tune. So those are the kinds of parameters that are very helpful to me, as opposed to write something, produce something. You got to have some kind of parameters. When you think about this question, you could leave it wide open to create something. Is it going to be a painting? Is it going to be music? Is it going to be dance? It's all creative. But I happen to be better at creating music than creating art, or visual art, certainly. So I can narrow it down. I'm much better at being able to compose a musical piece. And I'm certainly more adept at something in the jazz idiom than other idioms. And I happen to be a good saxophone player, so it makes sense if that's one of the parameters. And then you get more narrow. Am I going to write something at a certain tempo, in a certain meter, in a certain key? Those things I find very helpful. I often boil it down to what's the form going to be? And that might not reveal itself when the idea or the motive maybe comes to me, or I work with the motive. I don't really know what the form's going to be, but then it unfolds. It's like a puzzle. I like the aspect of letting it unfold, letting the form kind of reveal itself, fill in the harmonic gaps with stuff that doesn't make sense. I often come back to stuff years later and realize that really doesn't work. At that time, I didn't have enough theory to understand why it doesn't work, but I never liked it. And now I'm going to fix it, even after it's been recorded sometimes.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's interesting. So, if I'm guessing right, you're saying like what comes to you are like little motifs or motives or melodies, as opposed to, would a groove ever come to mind?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I believe I'm an equal opportunity, whatever comes to me. If I'm playing something on the horn and feel like it could be something, I write that down. If I don't have time to get to it, that's okay, as long as I have the idea. If I am fooling around with the piano and I happen to play something that seems like, geez, that might be a groove that I could use at some later date. Because when you need material, don't be too picky. Not everything works out. Not every idea that you're going to have. I always go back to that famous story about Beethoven writing the Eroica 3 different times before it became the Eroica. And of course, people perform those other, the Leonores. So not everything that you write down is going to make it. And most things that I've recorded, I don't play now. You just don't know. And you don't, no one can really let you know ahead of time how things are going to unfold 20 years hence. And if I've probably recorded at least 100 original compositions. I certainly couldn't perform 100 of my compositions. I don't have that kind of recall. So my repertoire is maybe, 10, 15, 20. And of those, if I have performance, I absolutely make sure that I practice those pieces that I've written, but you need to maintain that stuff just like any other repertoire. Just because you wrote it doesn't mean you know it.
Yeah, no, that's true. And okay, so are you saying, like, let's say something that you wrote like in the year like 2004, you're not, unless someone requests it or something like that, you're not revisiting that, or
I would have, first of all, at this point, at a point where I don't want to have a music stand in front of me. For years, I would hew to that rule more or less, but I would allow myself one tune that I was kind of still working on a gig. I would have the music. But I decided I just don't want to stand in front of people staring down at a music stand, period, end of story. So if I can't play it from memory, I don't play it. I have plenty of stuff I can perform. Some things that I've written, I just can't perform in the way that I want to perform in front of an audience. And if it means that it's too intricate, or maybe it does work on a recording, but it just doesn't work for me to be able to try and play it with the fluency that I need to entertain a live audience. So the majority of stuff that I've recorded, I couldn't perform unless I really worked on it.
Yeah, and actually, you know what? That also the point you're making as well. Sometimes pieces sound better as being recorded as opposed to playing live, because it's a different element. It's
a different medium.
Yeah,
and not everything that is recorded works as well in a live setting. And I suppose there's examples of the other way around. I remember asking this question when I was a student at Eastman, and Chick Corea came to give a master class, and the request phase of the class came up, and I raised my hand and said I wanted to hear, I think it was something off of, it was a great record he did with Joe, it's called Friends with Joe Farrell. And I mentioned something from that record, and he basically said, I don't know that. I recorded that several years ago. And to me, that was just, how could he not know that? You wrote it. It's like the old joke. It's a very coarse joke, but unless you're going to be practicing 24/7, you couldn't possibly have all that repertoire under your fingers. If it's repertoire of, at any given time, a dozen tunes, that's my limit. Maybe, and I'm not talking about playing standards, because usually standards, I might be able to recall enough to play if it were that kind of a gig. But if it's my own tune or composition that I haven't looked at in 3-4 years, I would never play that without a lot of preparation and practice.
And would you find yourself, like, let's say you have a 4 or 5 year old tune, and the need comes for you to play it again? Would you find yourself not reharmonizing it per se, but reworking it? Because maybe we grow every year. We grow as players and stuff.
That's true. I mean, I have done that with some tunes. I'm trying to think of an example of a tune where I did really rework it, and I'm playing it. I've done that, but nothing comes to mind where it was reworked that drastically and it worked enough for me. Usually it's pretty close to the way I recorded it, just possibly that I recorded it faster than I really wanted to because I had too much adrenaline at the recording session, and I'm trying to perform it at a slower tempo. Could be the reverse, where it was too slow at the recording and I'm playing at a little bit quicker tempo. But generally, and this is maybe just as much about efficiency as anything else, if I was happy enough with the recording, then I pretty much go back and study that and practice it more or less how I intended it. And again, like we said earlier, some things just don't or didn't lend themselves to live performance. I just didn't make the cut, let's say, but that's fine too. There's a lot of stuff that is recorded in jazz, pop music that just doesn't make it. I mean, we all know that if you look at jazz and pop music, there's lots of records that have been released over the years. We don't remember most of that. Maybe one or two things from a particular record are the tunes that sustained and that made any kind of a mark. The rest of it might be good, but maybe there's a reason why we don't recall it in the same way. And this, of course, there's some records that are just great, but sometimes I think you get into again, this is more about jazz mythology. Not every jazz record is great. A lot of jazz records are not great for different reasons, but we focus on the ones that are great. Kind of Blue, it's a great record. I often wonder, as I'm sure others have, did those guys know they were making this iconic record? I doubt it. I doubt that they knew it at the time. It's pretty hard to have that perspective. And there's a lot of great jazz records, but all the ones that are great are really superseded by a lot of records that are not as great. If everything was great, then there'd be no way to figure out what to listen to.
That's true. And, this leads me to a question, too. Do you have some composers have like a set time every day where they're composing, or at least they're composing every single day. Do you do something like that?
Not unless I have a deadline, really. Because to me, a project has different phases. And generally, I need some kind of a catalyst to get rolling. So if I have something on my calendar that I need to have new material by this date, then I know that a few months before that date, I better get rolling. And I need enough time to write music and write parts and then learn the music. So without that deadline, I have other things that I might do. Maybe record the music, practice other music, practice in 12 keys. So I'm sure you can relate to the fact that when you get a little bit older, you have to maintain your craft in order to be able to do the craft. So things don't come as easy physically. Yeah. And I do spend a fair amount of time, and not as much time as I should, but I am going to get my horn out and play a tune in 12 keys when I get done with this interview, because I know that I have to have that physical workout on the horn to be able to perform.
Okay, this is going to I was going to ask another question, but now we're going down this road, which is great. I was going to ask you, what does your practicing consist of? Like, do you have a set routine, or is it based on the tune that you're working on or a show that's coming up? What do you do?
Both. So an example could be, if I have nothing in the foreseeable future, which probably is the case now because we've been shut down for 2 years. I have little projects that I do, like my current project is playing Invitation in 12 keys. It's something that I've always wanted to do. And part of the mission of my, mid to late career is that I have told myself for many years, why is it that you've never learned a certain tune in 12 keys? You should do it. You could do it. Or maybe I need to prove to myself that I can do it. So this is a tune that I remember years ago, maybe 15 years ago, when I was more pressed for time. I didn't have as much time. I tried this and I just gave up. So now I can actually play Invitation in 12 keys. And it proves my point that practicing in 12 keys is the gold standard of practice. It really helps me. And I'm sure it helps anybody who does it, but you have to put that in a category. Of course, if I was obsessed to the extent that I neglected other practice and preparation, it's not helpful. So when I had a gig, I had a live stream broadcast about a month ago. I made sure I had my set list on my repertoire, and I practiced essentially those 8 tunes pretty much every day for a couple of weeks. So that when I went to that gig, I had that foundation. Because in addition to everything else, it's just like any classical piece that you learn in college. There's going to be lapses in concentration. You need to have a real good grounding to be able to give as good a performance as you possibly can give, because there's always going to be issues. Can't hear properly. You might feel, a little tired. You have to figure a way to practice as much as you can for all those kinds of pitfalls. And to me, performing is a lot about acting, even if you don't maybe feel that great at the time. For whatever reason, your audience doesn't care about that. They're looking to see a great performance. I learned that maybe the first of a few different life lessons with Buddy Rich. I saw Buddy Rich at times I know he wasn't feeling that great. And this is going back many years, 40 some years, but with the perspective of time, he wasn't that old, but, they didn't know about heart disease back then in the way that we do now. And looking back on it, I could see that he didn't feel well. I watched the guy literally almost pass out in the hot and humid Dominican Republic at a live performance. And you would never know. I mean, he gave 100% every single time. And I learned a lot about that. So that's why they say the show must go on. That's, to me, all about practice and preparation and experience.
Yeah, for sure. And let me ask you, I want to dive a little deeper into the practicing part. So, you mentioned sometimes you kind of have a routine, but, you're also working on tunes. So, how do you warm up? How do you work on technique? How do you work on a tune? How do you work on the improvisation of a tune? Because, you're a prolific author as well as composer. You've got these books on diminished scales, augmented scales, intervallic, improvisation. And I'm just curious as to how all this fits in to how you approach playing the horn.
That's a good question. So as much as I could boil it down, I'll confess that I don't really warm up a whole lot. Warming up for me would be, don't blow too hard, put your headgear on, which means for me, I put earplugs in or headphones on so that the sound of the horn isn't too loud for my old ears. And I kind of start off slow, but I don't generally practice in the way that a student would practice, which again, this is more about do what I say, not what I do. So as a student, you have to do rudiments. But for me, if I did that, I would never get to what I need to do. So for me, practice is in two categories. It's either practice for practice's sake, which is what we talked about. I always have a tune I'm learning in 12 keys. And I basically have a couple different tempos that I practice at, depending on the tune. And don't spend a lot of time deciding what to practice. Just pick up the horn and go. Because you could screw around with mouthpieces and reeds, and I go down that rabbit hole sometimes. But more often than not, I make myself pick up the horn and start. Put on a metronome or a drum beat and make myself play for minutes on end, sometimes 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes without stopping. And it's either the structure of playing the tune. Obviously, once you learn a tune, which is important, it's a process. I mean, it could take months when you learn a tune like, let's just say, Confirmation, Charlie Parker. It takes a long time to learn that head properly. When I went back and decided I wanted to play Confirmation in 12 keys, I realized I don't even know the melody in F. So I went back and found recordings, and I went back to the drawing board, tried to learn it properly. That took a while. Then the next part of the project is try and play it in different keys. It's a long road, but man, it's like when you get it, it's like a new toy. And for me, it's very satisfying. So that's a luxury, something that you don't often have the chance to do when you're having to worry about, geez, I got a show tonight. If I don't play the flute, I'm not going to feel in shape enough to perform this properly. So that's kind of my method now, is it's either practicing for kind of the ivory tower, which for me would be playing a tune in 12 keys, or I have a gig coming up. I need to work on these tunes, a lot of which, literally, if you ask my wife how many times she's heard me practice, see the Pyramid, for instance, the rhythm changes tune that I play on a lot of gigs. I mean, she could sing it to you. And it's not easy to sing, but I must have practiced that tune 500 times because it's hard. And if I don't practice it, I won't be able to perform it in a convincing way. So If I'm done with a particular engagement or a tour, then I can go back to the ivory tower kind of projects. So that's the shape that my practice takes for the most part.
It's interesting because you're approaching this. I've got two thoughts in my mind. You're approaching this in a sense, kind of like a classical musician, where you're really, you're working towards perfecting it. And, you know what I mean? With classical pieces and stuff like that, it has to be note perfect and that kind of thing. But you're also approaching it as an athlete, because as an athlete, you're on the field, you don't know what, you go into a new field, you don't know what the conditions are. It could rain, it could snow, it could, there could be other things going on.
Absolutely.
Windy. So you're preparing for everything.
That's an analogy that I use a lot. I like your analogy, but an analogy that I use is the football analogy. So if you're given the ball, either the quarterback or the running back, and you don't know who's going to come at you. And I like that analogy for improvising. If you end up in a place you really hadn't planned on, where are you going to go? Because you don't want to be too locked in that you can't get from a place you hadn't really planned on being to the next place. That's obviously not perfect, but the goal is to be able to create a seamless performance, which is usually an illusion, because the idea that you could play something cohesive without having practiced it thousands of times is, to me, just as unlikely as being able to start speaking a foreign language. I didn't grow up in Poland, so for me to start speaking Polish would be silly. So to be able to play in the jazz idiom and not have practiced those kinds of licks thousands of times and put them together in a cohesive way, that's not realistic. So there's a certain mythology, I think, about playing jazz that's misunderstood. But I really do like the analogy about the running back and not being too surprised if you end up in a place you hadn't planned on being. You got to go somewhere else in a hurry and hopefully not blink.
Yeah, this is interesting to me, because I'm thinking in my head, there's one situation where it's not as planned. And a lot of people that listen to this podcast attend jam sessions, for example. And so you may not know what tune is going to be called. So then how can you give us some advice, like for, those types of players? And it doesn't have to even be, necessarily students per se. I mean, these are pros that a lot of times go to jam sessions and they have their own goals to achieve from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I take my own advice as much as I possibly can. I played a gig with 3 terrific musicians just recently, and I knew that we were just going to play tunes, which I love to do because it is really challenging to try and, in a hurry, agree on what you all know in common. And a lot of the time, it's something that you haven't thought about in a while, but you could get through it enough to make a stab at performing it. And a lot of that has to do with not betraying your own inadequacies concerning the tune. If there's a little bit of it that you're not really sure what happens, this happens to me all the time. But obviously, you don't show that. You just got to get through it and fake it till you make it. That happens. That's a reality about that part of the idiom. That's why they used to call them fake books, because most, at least certainly me, most people are not going to be able to recall. If you ask me to write down the chord changes to a particular tune, I'm not the kind of person who could just, even if I could play it, I can't just sit down and write it. It would take me a while. But between the experience that I have and the relative mastery of the instrument and the relative understanding about what basic harmony pertains to the jazz idiom, you can really do a lot. So jazz harmony, for the most part, particularly in standard repertoire, it's very basic. Form generally boils down to, a few different forms. And once you understand that the form is obviously paramount, the most important thing is the rhythm, and the feel. And then you just try and plug in as many notes as hopefully gets the harmony across in a convincing idiomatic way. That's the whole ball game, pretty much. It's not realistic to think that you're going to be able to perform it in the same way that you would in my case of my own tune. If I know what's coming up and I practice it for a couple of weeks every day at a time, it's a different kind of skill. It's certainly very challenging to me. And if I'm performing for myself with my band, I don't choose to do that because I know that for me, it's more of an academic exercise. Even if I could do it at a pretty high level, it's not my preference, but I recognize how much fun it is and how relatively good I am at it. I did grow up learning a lot of tunes, and I know a fair amount of tunes, but there's a lot I don't know. And at this point, I'm not as likely to pick a random tune. In a perfect world, it'd be great, but here's an example. I'm not going to go learn, even though I think I've performed this 4-in-1 Thelonious Monk. I'm not going to spend that time unless somebody says, you're going to record this, we're going to pay you, and you need to learn it. Then, of course, I would, but there's just obviously infinite material. So at this point, I probably wouldn't try and expand that vocabulary. Sometimes the tune really does pique my interest. There's a great tune I learned recently that I never had learned. I mean, this happens all the time. Minor League by Grant Green, which is one of my absolute favorites, but I didn't really discover that until just a couple of years ago. So there's always, you have to pick and choose. What is this really what I want to spend my time doing? Or do I have a deadline I need to think about? And I just don't have that luxury right now.
Well, yeah. And not only that too, I mean, we're kind of coming out of COVID, but things aren't totally opened up for musicians, and touring is dicey at this point. But you've been involved with so many iconic bands, but as of late, especially Steely Dan. I'm curious as to how you got that gig, how that what that's like, that experience touring with Steely Dan and stuff like that. I know the listeners are going to be curious about that too.
I mean, it's been great. What can I say? It's a wonderful job. It's hard to believe now that I began to work with those guys in earnest 19 years ago. In 2002, I made the record Everything Must Go. I'm on a little more than half of it. And the next year, I was invited to begin to tour with the band. And here it is, 2021. We're supposed to go out actually in 3 weeks for about a month after, as you know, many cancellations and postponements. It's just been a wonderful job. And like other great opportunities that I've had, leaders who are really good at what they do, they make their decisions with some good information and understand that someone like me coming from a jazz background, I didn't have a lot of experience. I didn't have any experience in the pop idiom really, except for, nothing at that level. And I think there was kind of an implied understanding that they were going to let me grow into the job. Because when I listened to myself early on, I really didn't do with it what I would do now. And part of that, I guess, is just because I've matured as a player somewhat. But the experience that I had at that time that I was able to bring to bear was enough that I could hang on to the job. I had a lot of, believe it or not, most of the job, or at least a big part of the job, was to play in the section correctly. And section playing is something that some musicians don't really get. They can't subordinate. Some musicians are really just meant to be leaders. Fortunately, I feel like I know how to be a sideman as well as a leader. And I grew up playing in big bands and playing in sections. But I'll say that when I was young, I had no idea. I didn't learn how to properly play in a section until I was an adult. So that was lucky for me that I had that experience, because they were very focused. Your ability to add to the music, not take over the music. And I'm interested in that. And as a soloist, are you able to carry that mantle, to carry the ball in such a way that still complements the music? Not that I was never, ever told that I needed to play a particular way, ever. So it's been just a great experience. A lot of growth for me. And obviously, on hindsight, I kind of see myself as someone who is like-minded to Donald Fagen and of course Walter Becker in my attention to detail and my kind of maybe I don't want to say obsessiveness, but the degree with which I want the music to be right.
It's actually, attention to detail and preparedness. You said it before, just, feeling prepared enough to be able to perform at the level that you want to. A couple of things I'm curious about, because number one, who writes the horn section charts? Do you guys figure it out by ear? Like, how does that work?
Like, very occasionally by ear, but our horn section leader is Michael Lenhart, and he writes the horn arrangements. He writes the band arrangements for the most part.
Oh, okay, got it.
If there's a tune that hasn't been performed in a while, Michael is the guy who charts it out.
Got it. Okay, so then there's that, and then the other thing is, a big difference between pop, rock music, whatever, and the jazz idiom is that in the jazz idiom, you can have more than one chorus at a time. But when you're dealing with pop solos, 8 measures, 16, maybe 32, maybe you're playing over the singer, whatever. So can you give some tips as to, I guess, number one, how to approach, very short solos and how do I want to word this? The word energy comes to mind, but you have to have a certain level of energy to the solo. So what your thought process is when you only have 8 or 16 measures?
That's a great question. And I think for me, the way I was able to approach it was because I've had a fair amount of big band solo experience. So it's different than, as you know, playing in a small group where the choruses might not be predetermined. Although I think that for myself, maybe because of my professional upbringing, I tend to hew to shorter solos. So in a big band, generally solos are not that long, and you pretty much have to get to the point very quickly because, like you say, you want to captivate the audience now. I mean, this is all, of course, dependent on the situation. I remember playing with, I did a lot of work over the years with the Vanguard Jazz Orchestra. That's an atypical situation. It's not like the Buddy Rich Band where everything is kind of to the point in a hurry. The Vanguard Band is almost like a big, small group where you might have a very, very open solo. Whether or not in live performance that's effective or not as a whole, we're not going to get into value judgments about that. But that's just a reality, that playing in a conventional big band is different than something like that. And certainly there's lots of situations where Maria Snyder's band is another example. It's a different kind of an idiom. But my upbringing certainly was not that. It was about, stand and deliver now. And if a couple bars go by and it's not evident that you have taken charge, it doesn't work. So I was able to bring that experience to bear when I joined Steely Dan because it seems very similar to me. And I feel like I've gotten a little bit better over the years at that. And rather than try and make it something that's not, the job as it is, to me, it's perfect. So if you want a lot of solos, I always say, get your own band, write your own material. But a situation that is a for-hire situation, you're not going to be able to, it's not realistic to alter the parameters. The parameters are what they are. So for me, I definitely feel like I always respected the job, but I've gotten better at doing the job I hope. And a lot of that is because of experience and practice and preparation. It's got to do with this to me is common in jazz too. If you heard me play on Monday night in Copenhagen and you hear me play on Wednesday night in Oslo, you're going to hear pretty much the same thing. I mean, the idea that you're going to hear a different player, to me, if you hear the Mozart flute concerto on Wednesday and you hear the Mozart clarinet concerto on Thursday, that's why he's identifiable, because people are who they are. So I recognize that for me, I'm playing a lot of the same licks, and I would just want to play them flawlessly and seamlessly in a way that has the illusion of spontaneity, even if it's not. That's the job. If you went to a Broadway show on Wednesday and it's done well, and you go to it on Thursday again, you're going to hear exactly the same thing. That's the idea. You know, your job is to entertain the audience. So that, obviously, there are people who might have a different view about that. When I went and saw the Miles Davis Band play in the 80s, it didn't strike me as effective because those guys had the luxury of experimentation. I don't really feel like I have that luxury.
Are you saying when you saw we got cut off for a second. Are you saying when you saw Miles Davis, you didn't see that? Like each performance was different?
I saw them experimenting to a large degree.
Okay, got it.
And it was interesting, but I think I recognized even then that's not what I would choose to do.
Okay.
People can agree or disagree. I like to have somewhat of a guarantee this is going to be a performance that's going to be buttoned up within the idiom. So I'm not standing around after the first song deciding what the second song is going to be. I know what the second song is going to be. So I found those kind of foundations of putting together a performance reinforced, or I felt vindicated when I worked with Steely Dan, because the period of rehearsal has a lot to do with repetition. And as a jazz musician, sometimes you don't get that so much. And for a while, it was hard to get used to. We're playing this again and again and again. Well, why? Because you need a solid foundation if you're going to entertain on a high level. That's just the way it is. And if you're not okay with that, then you might want to think about a different facet of how to perform in front of an audience, but it's not going to be the same thing. So I've taken a lot of that. I guess that's just, you are what you eat. That's just natural for me.
Okay, so can I just clarify for myself, because I want to make sure I understand this. So, let's say you have two different, Steely Dan tunes, right? And are you saying that you, I don't want to say the word preconceive your solo, or do you work out a solo that you will always play over a tune?
No, it's not that. I acknowledge that I'm going to gravitate and evolve into playing a lot of the same stuff from night to night. But I don't practice the solo per se. It's somewhere in between. But for me to arbitrarily try a whole different thing, it's taking a bit of a chance, because maybe it doesn't go well.
Yeah,
I don't want to have that responsibility if there's 15,000 people watching the band. I don't even do that if there's 15 people watching my quartet play. I generally go with what I know.
Yeah, and especially I'm just
thinking, the same. I mean, to me, I wouldn't put on a different mouthpiece in the middle of a gig either.
Yeah. Or try a different strength reed.
Yeah. Well, I've had to do that on different occasions when it's 110 degrees out and dry and you have to put on a different reed, but I wouldn't choose to do it.
Right. And I'm just thinking too, like we mentioned the word like energy and, having to carry the mantle and stuff like that. And you only have 8 measures to do it. Yeah. So you're going to be relying on certain types of things, in your repertoire to do that. I
allow myself basically to revisit all that I have done previous to that moment and give as good a performance as I can, rather than trying to reinvent myself from night to night, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, totally, totally. And and let's take that word reinvent in a second. Not actually, it's not even reinventing, but we're going to go left field for a minute and revisit a topic we did before when it comes to composition. But you've got an album coming out, Introspection.
I do.
And unfortunately, COVID had a huge role in this. So can you talk about the conception of Introspection? Didn't mean to say it like that, but can you talk about the conception of that?
That's perfect. That's perfect. Good segue.
Yeah.
The first half was recorded right before the pandemic in 2020 in Copenhagen with my European quartet. It was our third recording together, and we planned to record not a whole project. We recorded 6 tunes, which ended up becoming the first half of that project, partially because I think at the time we didn't know and the business is changing so fast. We didn't know if it was going to be a whole album or what that was going to be. We knew the tunes were going to be released electronically on electronic media. And then, of course, everything stopped and our tour was canceled this past January, February. I was forced to come to terms with the fact that I didn't want to wait until 2022 to continue and to finish out this project. So against all odds, I learned how to record at home with the help of some very patient and good friends. And my sidemen recorded their parts in Berlin, in the case of the bassist, Andreas Lang, and Anders Morgensen and Carl Winter recorded in Copenhagen at the same studio we've been working at for a few years. And I assembled everything myself, and it was mixed and mastered, and now it's done. So that's the second half of Introspection, which is coming out in earnest on October 15th. So if you had told me even a year ago I'd be doing this, I would have said no. Because whenever people talk about, oh yeah, I have a home studio, my reaction is, that's the last thing I need. I got practicing to do. I just don't have any idea how I would do that. Well, necessity, again, is another invention. So I realized, what am I waiting for? I got nothing else to do. And somehow I got it. I did it. And it's exciting to be able to adapt in a way that you didn't think you could. And I don't know what lies ahead. I'm not 100% sure we'll be able to tour this coming January.
Oh,
but
yeah.
we still have to move ahead somehow and make music. That's our job. So it was a big project. Gratifying. Did it unfold in the way that I thought it would? Certainly not. But I learned that I can adapt, and it's liberating in a lot of ways. Number one, you get to do as many takes as you want without the limitation of the time in the studio in that one day. So that's different. So it's very, very satisfying to be able to have that brought to fruition.
I'm just curious too, because you have your European quartet, right? So do you foresee this as, especially with, we're still not obviously done with this pandemic, but could you foresee yourself doing more projects like this where you're doing the remote recording?
I guess I can. At least I know how to do it now. I haven't been as active as others. I don't really do commercial work remotely as a lot of musicians do, but I have done a few things remotely for hire, and it's fun. So absolutely. I mean, who knows what's coming up, but I'm grateful that I was able to get this together and that I can participate and not get left behind, because that's the alternative. At a certain point, what am I practicing for if I can't take it to the next level?
Let me ask you, what equipment did you get? What, if you don't mind sharing?
Oh, it's pretty basic stuff. I have a real great old friend, Mike Smith, who's also a saxophone player. He's been into this stuff for years, and I talked to him every so often. When we spoke in, I guess it was October, November of last year, he told me all about the latest stuff, and he said, you should do this, that, and the other. Of course, he's had a studio in his house for 20 years, way before most musicians did. But I said what I always say, which is, because it's going to take up all my time and I won't be able to practice and play my tunes in 12 keys and keep my repertoire. And I got off the phone and I said, I need to get off this idea that I can't do this and I can't change. And so he told me what to get. I got something called a Scarlett interface, and I had a pretty good microphone, a company called Warm. So what I have is a Neumann copy, and I got that because it was recommended to me, and I recorded with this microphone over the years. Not this is a copy, but I recorded on a Neumann for years in studios, and it was familiar to me. And for my needs, that's great. I could spend, I'm sure, a ton more money on other microphones. And at some point, I might buy another microphone, but that's what I have. I have a little mixing board that helps, and I learned how to use Logic, which is a Macintosh software. I actually hired a student at a local university to help me with this. We had virtual lessons, still do sometimes, because I don't know how I could figure this stuff out without people to teach me and help me. And again, I don't think that I'm not going to get into it to the extent that somebody might if they were going to be a recording engineer. I can do what I need to do, and I leave the other stuff to the professionals. As far as mastering and real mixing, I have an idea what I want, but it's good to know. And it took me a while to figure this out, and you'd think that I'd know better by now, but you got to know your limitations. So I'm good at playing the saxophone. I'm good at writing music. And at this point, I can turn on the microphone and I can record. I've also learned that I'm good at assembly and editing. But as far as the real ins and outs of mixing and mastering, don't try and do something you're not qualified to do. So that fortunately was a lesson that I learned before it was too late. And this is, it's not rocket science. It's something that lots of musicians do now. 20 years ago, I would tell students, if you don't have notation software, get notation software. That's like a secretary not having a typewriter. Or 100 years ago, not being able to have good penmanship. Or 50 years ago, like not having a telephone. I mean, you could do it, but it's a lot more efficient to join the human race. You used to get a bonus on the West Coast for having a home studio, but now you don't. Everybody just assumes that you can do this. So I would just say it might be something to think about.
For sure. I love that. Not to join the human race. I'm still laughing at that. That's so funny. But I think it's great how you did adapt. And, I'm sure you're excited that this album is coming out. It's coming out digitally, October 15th.
And hard copy.
Oh, and hard copy too. That's right. This physical CD release. Where can people find the album?
I guess if you want to buy hard copy, it's on Amazon and those other kinds of things. Whatever other resellers, I guess.
Okay, and then
hard copies are almost a dinosaur now, but
I
yes.
like my hard copies.
I do too.
I'm staring at my collection of CDs right now, and you know what? And the other day I went to a used record store and I bought a whole ton of stuff because
nice.
Yeah, had some Dexter Gordon stuff that I've been looking for. Joe Henderson.
Oh, terrific.
Yeah, just maybe I'm a dinosaur. I don't care. I like my CDs.
Not at all. Hey, listen, they say that vinyl's coming back. The new live Steely Dan record, actually 2 records. There's one, we did a live version of the Nightfly. That record and the Steely Dan live record are both on vinyl. And I just got my complimentary copies. I don't even have a turntable.
Oh, I have one.
But
I actually have one.
I still subscribe to the fact that it's nice to have a hard copy, like a book.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. Before we go, there was one question I did want to ask you. Who is the musician? I was going to say saxophone player, but let's just say musician. Who's the musician that most inspired you?
That's a big question.
I know. I have a thought, but I could be wrong. But anyway.
I couldn't narrow it down to just one. There's certainly saxophone players that I was very influenced by, and jazz players that weren't primarily saxophone players, arrangers, writers. So as far as saxophone players, probably the usual list, probably the same ones that inspired you, but I grew up listening to Dexter Gordon, Stan Getz, John Coltrane, Charlie Parker, Jackie McLean, Wayne Shorter, of course. Sonny Stitt was a big influence for me. I actually had a private lesson with Sonny Stitt when I was first in New York.
Wow.
That's one of my jewels as a young, precocious, pain in the neck kind of a guy who wouldn't take no for an answer. So I was influenced by all the same players that many of us are influenced by, and loved, as a pretty young person, the Keith Jarrett European group. Later on, I discovered the Keith Jarrett American Quartet with Dewey Redman. That was a huge influence for me as a saxophone player, and have been very influenced by the great arrangers, Gil Evans, Don Sebesky. He's a great commercial arranger. So I guess that's, in a nutshell, that's a lot of it.
That's cool. I definitely would have said Coltrane, because I hear that in your playing for sure. And
Thank you.
Now I'm curious also, the modern players, the contemporary players right now. Is there anybody out there that you're like, wow, this person's like really awesome? Anybody that inspires you now?
Yeah, there are a lot. My peers are big influences, of course, and of course there's a whole younger generation too. A lot of great players. You know, I'm not that current these days, but I've heard and listen to satellite radio on a daily basis. You hear a lot of great young players, but I always love to hear great young musicians. I mean, students of mine over the years have inspired me. There's no limit to where you can find your inspiration. Obviously, my peers have been very influential. I just listened to one of my best friends, Jim Snydero's reissue of his strings record, and listening to a certain passage and saying, "Now, wait a minute, did I get that from him or did he get that from me?" And I honestly couldn't tell you, because we more or less grew up together as young adults, played in the same bands, and we're very influential to each other. I have tremendous respect for Chris Potter, obviously, and Joel Fromm, other contemporaries of mine. I mean, there's a lot. Doug Webb, great player in LA.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just an enormous amount of players, but a lot of the time I could listen 24/7 and not scratch the surface. And Chris Speed was, to me, to hear this guy play, it was unbelievable. Years ago, I mean, I know he's probably this whole generation younger than I. Gave a lesson to Sam Sadigursky when he was still in high school. And this guy is unbelievable. Interesting to me because he's also a great clarinet player. So that's just a few. Those are just saxophone players that come to mind, but there's a ton of musicians over the years.
That's awesome. Listen, Walt, I know we're a little pressed for time, and I wanted to thank you so much for being gracious with your time. And there were so many things that you mentioned that were just really so interesting to me, and of course to the listeners. I want to remind people that Walt's album will be out, Introspection, October 15th, and I'm thinking that it'll also electronically be available on your website.
I know there's a link. You mean to buy the CD or to listen?
To listen. So like if they wanted to download.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there's a link.
Okay.
Yeah,
awesome.
Spotify is, something that most of us use now.
Got it. All right.
So it's certainly on all those e-media things. Is that what they call it?
Well, actually, they'd call it now.
Stuff like that.
Yeah, stuff like that. So it's probably Spotify, probably Amazon Music.
Yeah.
Apple, iTunes. Yeah, I can't get used to calling it Apple Music anymore. But but this is great. It's been such a pleasure catching up again. And
thank you, Donna. It's a great opportunity.
Thank you so much again.